The Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest is a quilt show that happens in Hampton, Virginia, every year around this time, late February, early March. And it's one that's been on my bucket list for a while because it's about 2.5 hours from home, definitely worth a day trip. Last year, I told folks that I was going to drive down for the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest, but when I found out that the dates for Quilt Fest were the same as the dates for QuiltCon, I had to back out of that because I had already made commitments to go to QuiltCon in Atlanta. This year, though, things changed because the dates were back-to-back weekends and I was able to make it. So that's what we're going to talk about. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, I want to talk to you about my experience with the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest. Now, this is going to be a video that is really more heavy on quilt show goodness. I'm going to show you all of the quilts that I saw that inspired me and just caught my eye or took my breath away. But we're going to get to that in just a minute. Before we do, I want to let you know that this is the first show that I had quilts hanging in for competition. If you follow my channel for a little bit, you know that around this time last year, my guild had a show and I had 2 quilts in that show. Well, those were just on display. That was not a show that had any judging, no viewers' choice, no competition whatsoever. It was just a beautiful display of pieces of work that some talented quilters in my guild made, and I was lucky enough to be included in that show with 2 different pieces. This time around with the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest, though, it was totally different. I entered Ursa, which is my Legit Kits Ursula Minor kit, and I also entered a quilt that I'm calling Flock of Geese. It was the quilt that was created with the Bliss sew along, and you'll see both of those in the virtual quilt show that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. Now, I'm going to let you know that neither one of those quilts won a ribbon, but I did get some really good notes and some decent remarks on the quilts, and I'll share those when we get to the quilts in just a few minutes. Before we dive into the quilts, I have one last thing that I want to tell you about. What was my thought? What was my impression of Quilt Fest? Well, it felt a little congested, at least where the vendors were. The quilts were spaced out nicely. You had enough room to back up and really take in the full quilt and just absorb the beauty that was radiating from these beautiful pieces of art. The vendors were a different situation though. And I don't know if that's because they had too many vendors or they just had it laid out differently, but it felt like the vendor booths were very, 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 very cramped, and there was no way to shop the vendor without basically being in the aisle. I encountered several times multiple people actually browsing the shop selection while standing in the aisle. And so it created this whole thing where you'd be walking down the aisle and then you have to stop because somebody decided to stop and shop. So if I were to offer any advice to the Mancuso show management team who puts on Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest, it would be to space those vendors out just a little bit more. If we can't give them a bigger booth, I get it, I understand, but make the aisles a little bit wider so that when people do stop, it doesn't cause a traffic jam. Other than that, the show was great. I loved going. I loved seeing all of the beautiful pieces of work that were there, and I even did a little shopping. All right, that's all of my notes about the show. Let's get to the quilts, and then don't forget, at the end of the video, I'm going to let you know how my quilts did in the show overall. The first vendor I went to was, of course, the Legit Kits booth. We got to meet Chuck and see all of these gorgeous kits in person. Ian and I each picked up a kit that we plan to do a collab with in the fall, so you'll want to stay tuned for that. This is Hidden Star by Kathleen Scala. She writes that she was inspired by a picture of a quilt called Hidden Star on the internet. When she clicked on the image, it brought her to a page with the instructions for making it, and she liked it so much that she made 2. She found the pattern over on AnnieMcHugs.com if you want to check it out. I'll put a link in the description box down below. This is Midnight Flower Garden by Natalie Diallo. Not sure I'm pronouncing that right. She says she always loved barn quilts and was thrilled to participate in the Barn Quilt Challenge. She picked this pattern because it spoke to her. She chose grunge fabrics because they reminded her of worn painted wood, and she quilted it with just straight lines as if it was on wood and didn't finish some lines as if it was worn. This wasn't entered for competition. It was part of the Tidewater Quilters Guild exhibit called Water Everywhere. It was Stormy Sunset by Debbie Coleman, and I absolutely loved everything about it, from the colors of the reds and the oranges and the yellows to the quilting in the background, and most of all, the illusion of curved piecing thanks to those half rectangle units. This quilt took first place in the innovative category. It's called Really Wild Flowers by Sharon Schlotzhauser. Gosh, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. She says this is her fourth quilt in her whimsical, very dimensional Wild Flowers series, and it is the most complex quilt that she has made to date. It is a playful garden scene of wild, as in crazy, fanciful, imaginative flowers, arches, and butterflies. Designed to be bright and joyful, some of the flowers have my signature open centers, as I call them. Others are layered and appliqued, as are the butterflies, embellished with Swarovski crystals, beads, buttons, and metal charms. These next two items are articles of clothing that I thought was kind of cool. The first one up is a quilted sweater that Ben Millett created. It took first place, and I thought this was really cool because I actually got to meet him at QuiltCon. The second item is a cloak that I thought was really kind of cool, and I could totally picture my daughter wearing to Renfest. Monopoly in our home is a competition that we take very seriously. So when I saw this quilt, I definitely had to grab some footage of it for my vlog. I think my husband saw it. I'm not sure. Anyway, somebody made a quilt after the Monopoly board for the series Games People Play. OMG. This was Sherbert on a cloudy day, and it won the best of show. Everything about this quilt from Paige Johnson spoke to me. From the shapes of the items in the quilt, the piecing, the applique, the quilting, even the colors. I'm not surprised this took best in show, and I feel a little bit better when I read the description and found that it was a collaboration of 4 people that put that together. So I don't feel as inadequate. Gorgeous quilt, ladies. This beautiful piece of work is from Patricia Skiles from Virginia Beach, Virginia. It's called The Hole in My Heart. She writes that the quilt was her creative way to work through the grief of her husband's death. He was the biggest supporter of her quilting arts, and she worked through her grief with quilting and writing. The heart is an original paper piece pattern, and the original poem was done with infusible ink. The back of the quilt is fabric printed from scanned images of letters that they exchanged over a 26-year naval career. Deborah Newhall from Vienna, Virginia created Pop Flower. She said that her intention was to create a vibrant quilt that reflected the pop art that was so popular during her childhood and teen years. She used a very bright palette of colors and paired them with a graphic black with white flower centers. She hopes this quilt will bring a smile to everyone who sees it. This gorgeous quilt is basically one face, 2 different portrayals. And the artisan here is Sandy Curran out of Newport News, Virginia. She calls this That Can't Be Accurate. And in the write-up, she says that she often walks around gratefully thinking that she's the one on the right until she looks in the mirror and thinks, that can't be accurate. This is Polar Bear Portrait by Jill Huntington. It's an original quilt pattern that she created based on the artwork of artist Josh Brill. The mid-century modern aesthetic is achieved through simple geometric forms, asymmetry, and bold, clean lines. She was first drawn to the mid-century modern style through the art of Charlie Harper, whose work depicting animals is described as highly stylized geometric reduction. The water's reflection on the polar bear's chest is my favorite design element. This did win honorable mention in the mid-century mod category, and obviously you can see why. This is another quilt of a polar bear, and it's actually my entry into the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest. This is Ursa, which means little bear. It is a wall hanging from a legit Kits kit. I was super excited to have this hanging at the show. It did not take home a ribbon, but it was proudly displayed next to this beautiful quilt that did get a ribbon, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But I did joke around with my husband that I felt like they just put the ribbon next to the wrong quilt. Okay, let's talk about this one now. It's called The Sun Will Rise Again from Jane Scheimer, and it did win Best Long Arm Machine Workmanship. I hope I read the ribbon correctly. It says the quilt celebrates the joy of returning to in-person events. While the definition of normal has changed, the sun still rises every day and we adapt. I created this quilt at the first retreat I attended after the COVID shutdown. I dyed fabric that captures memories of walking on the beach and watching the sun rise over the ocean. This was called Just Stop in the Modern Monochrome category, and it's from Gwen Milhoen, who was a history educator for over 40 years. And she created this because she said quilters of the past generations often included social commentary in their designs. And she decided to do the same to express her frustrations with the growing division in our country. This is My Brother's Car by Sandra Mullen. She writes, while on an outing to a winery in my brother's antique Oldsmobile, I grabbed a quick picture of him standing beside the car. My work frequently is the study of reflection in water and on glass, and now reflection in chrome. I wanted to make regular fabric appear to shine and reflect without any metallic component to the fabric. And by the way, this quilt totally won the blue ribbon for best interpretation of the theme in the wall quilt category. This is a painted color wheel, pieced and quilted by Brenda McQuilliam. She said the picture she was given showed a handful of paintbrushes and she just wanted to put them in an orderly color wheel. This is called The Healing Heart from Paula Dean. She said this self-portrait is a visual representation of the thought process of grief. My husband snapped a picture when I wasn't paying any attention and it portrays the loss I was feeling. It was the moment that I knew it was going to be okay. I chose to create a self-portrait because I felt that it was the most honest way to express my grief and loneliness I felt. I challenged myself to use only the lights, mediums, and darks on the panel from Classic Fabrics Royal Beauty, which you can see here. This is called Refreshed by Marietta Nestor. She says, hiking sun-drenched mountains brings on a deep thirst that can only be quenched with water. Staying hydrated is essential. Clean drinking water is very valuable to all people and animals. Capturing the moment of refreshment is reflected in the cool blue to warm brown colors. Continuous contours, stitch, drawing defines movement throughout the piece. This is sliced by Amy Kirkemeyer. Gosh, I hope I pronounced that correctly. She says, I love geometric forms, particularly curves. I based this on a little sketch I made in my notebook one day. I wanted the piece to have a lot of energy, so I chose bold colors set on a charcoal background for contrast. This was also a technical challenge for me to learn how to make the templates I would need in order to create my sketch. This, by the way, won a blue ribbon for best use of negative space in the mid-century mod category. This is Star Blossom by Debbie Martin. She says she has always loved the look of a star in quilts, especially in the center. And to be able to make a quilt with a star in the middle and have the seams line up has been a journey. Preach, sister, preach. This quilt reminded me how far I've come. When I reflect on the techniques I've learned and mastered, it still amazes me. This is Ghost of the Mountains by Jamie Lynn Houston. She said Ghost of the Mountains is a rare snow leopard that lives mostly in the Asian mountains, and its long bushy tail provides agility for jumping and climbing cliffs, and it's also known to jump across 50-foot cliffs, which makes it the world champion of long jumpers of all mammals. She did receive a third place in the innovative category for the quilt competition, and she writes that she received permission from Dieter Braun, who is a children's book illustrator residing in Hamburg, Germany, to do the quilting on this cat. This is called Simple Luxury by Susan Braverman. She said it was a challenge to create interesting composition using only quarter circles and rectangles. She puzzled the shapes together in various sizes with strategic pops of color, and the end result brings to mind the simple luxury of a bubble bath. This did win Best Use of Color in the Mid-Century Mod category. I love this one. It's called Killer Whale by Anna Willard. I didn't grab the actual artist statement, but I did want to include it in my recap of the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest because y'all know this girl loves whales and dolphins. And OMG, can you just take a look at this guy's eye? Isn't it so cute? This is a blue ribbon quilt from Jill Huntington called Portland, My City of Roses, and it is in the innovative category. She had a beautiful artist statement written that helped me realize all of the things that are in this quilt were different landmarks and depictions of Portland, Oregon. Can you spot them? I'll leave you with this final quilt, which was my second entry into the Mid Atlantic Quilt Festival. This is a flock of geese. It was created from the Bliss Quilt Along, hosted by Fat Quarter Shop a couple years ago. If you remember, I started doing video tutorials for these blocks, got about halfway through. When the finishing layout was revealed, I was a little behind. And once I saw all those flying geese putting this together, I decided it was not something I was going to finish. I paid it on to a subscriber by the name of Stephanie Fulton and never expected for it to return back to my doorstep. So you can imagine the surprise that I saw when this beautiful quilt made its way back to me. As a tribute to the support that all of you, my subscribers and viewers, have shown me over the years, I have taken the quilt with mine and Stephanie's name and entered it into the Mid Atlantic Quilt Festival. Listen! My quilts didn't get a ribbon, and I'm okay with that because did you see some of those quilts that did have the ribbons? It doesn't mean that my quilts were bad. It just means that that quilt won and deserved it more than mine did, and I'm okay with that. Listen, some of those quilts honestly had my jaw on the floor, and the ones that won ribbons were light years beyond where the two that I submitted were, and I'm okay that I didn't get a ribbon. I did get a little participation trophy, though. I have a label that I can affix to the back of both of my quilts as a badge of honor to show that it was on display at Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest 2024, and I'll take it. I do have my scorecards back from the judges, and I want to share those with you. So let's dive into it. We're going to start off with Ursa. Now, if you remember, this is a kit from Legit Kits. It was my very first quilt that I FPP'd, foundation paper pieced from start to finish. It was also the first quilt that I did matchstick quilting on, and maybe you can tell. Overall, the judges were very gentle with me, I feel. They were kind. The quilt had good comments and good ratings. But there are two areas that they could rate you on. They could do design and workmanship. They did not rate me on design because it was a kit. It does look like when I look at the scorecard that they had started to rate me on design and then realized it was a kit and had to erase those markings because I can see some leftover trace marks from pencil writing. So there's that. The bottom area is workmanship, and they rate you on your piecing, your quilting technique, and your finishing. And for all three of those areas, I got a very good. That's better than I thought I would do. I thought for piecing, I would probably get a good or a very good, but for quilting technique, yeah, when I look at the matchstick quilting on Ursa, especially when I compare it to some of the matchstick quilting that I saw at Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest, it was lacking. And so I did not expect to get a very good, but I got that very good. Finishing also got a very good. So overall, the quilt got a very good, but it was only rated on workmanship. There was a note from the judges that said, quilters read and follow guidelines, comma, no kits are competitive. And I'm not really sure what that meant. I don't know if they were telling me in the future, read the guidelines for your quilt entry because kits aren't accepted, or it was a note to themselves that said, hey, the quilter just read and followed the guidelines. Kits aren't competitive. Like I don't know what that meant. But I am taking away from that two things. Thing number one, I feel like Ursa didn't get a ribbon because she wasn't even considered for it because she was a kit. Thing number two, when I enter future shows, I'm going to look at the guidelines a little bit more carefully to see if kits are allowed because as it comes or turns out, some shows don't allow kits to be entered. And I'm learning that lesson with the Quilt Fest Greenville. There's actually a little blurb on their entry rules that say no kits. So yeah, I need to pay closer attention to that. The second quilt that I entered was a flock of geese, and this was my Bliss Sew Sampler quilt. I Loved putting this together, but I can't take the credit for any of the design markings because it was fabric pulled by Fat Quarter Shop. It was patterns from Fat Quarter Shop. And when it comes to the workmanship area, I can only claim about half of that because I made some of the blocks, but ultimately I feel like a lion's share of the work was done by Stephanie Fulton. The quilt did pretty well overall. Let me run you through this really quick. In the design area, they do everything including quilting layout. You got 3 very goods and 3 goods. And like I said, most of that rating really goes back to Fat Quarter Shop, though I do want to pull out the quilting design area because that one goes to Beth from Goody Goods. She got a very good for that. She chose the quilting design, she chose the thread. I did not tell her what I wanted at all. She designed, she picked, and she executed. So Beth, if you're watching, thank you for your quilting on that because it got a very good. In the workmanship area, this is an area that we would split. The piecing, I feel like I get half of the credit for. The quilting technique, I think, is 100% Beth, and the finishing, I kind of get half credit for because I started the binding and Mary tacked it down to the back. So we're going to share credit here. All 3 of those areas were very good. So Beth, again, your quilting got a very good on this quilt. Stephanie, congratulations. We got a very good on our piecing. And Mary, congratulations. We got a very good on the finishing, which I think is the binding. So yeah, overall, I was happy with how this quilt was received. There were a couple of notes on the report card. One said fun sampler quilt, and the other one said the quilting enhances the quilt nicely. So again, Beth, that one's for you. I am so proud that these quilts were on display at the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest, and I cannot wait to enter future shows. Though, if there's any one thing that I have taken away from this entire experience, I want to prioritize the creation of unique quilts that go into show rotation. I don't want to just enter quilts that were a result of a kit or even just a pattern that somebody else wrote. So my brain is already spinning with quilting design ideas that I can turn into reality and get into show rotation starting in 2025. You'll have to stay tuned to see what I come up with. Thank you, friends, so much for checking out the Mid Atlantic Quilt Fest with me, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!